So long as we have running politics that runs on private money, whether that's from trade unions or individual donors, we will have conflicts of interest because political parties have to raise money, so they go to these people to try and raise money. And the people with the deepest pockets are the ones who get the most access because they're the ones who have the most money.
We've got a great guest, Peter Geoghegan, who's an investigative journalist. He's the author of the Sunday Times best-selling book, Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics. And he also writes the Substack called Democracy for Sale. Peter, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, look, what do you make of where this story is going? I mean, there's quite a few different strands to it, but what's your take on it?
Yeah, I think you did a good job there, Ayesha, of picking some of them apart. You know, what we are seeing is effectively more and more details coming about reforms funding and about funding that we didn't know about. The first bit is this £5 million gift from Christopher Harborne, which Nigel Farage says was a personal gift, had nothing to do with politics. But bearing in mind, this came from someone who'd given over £10 million to Nigel Farage's Brexit party previously and then went on to fund reform. So I think that's quite a tricky line for reform to stand on. But secondly, I think almost in some ways more concerning is the stories coming out of the Sunday Times, as you mentioned, about these donations from George Cottrell's mother. George Cottrell, the convicted fraudster. His mother has given quite a bit of money to reform. Questions have been asked about the progeny of some of those fundings. But what we're now seeing is money going to Richard Tice's company that then went to reform. Richard Tice says nothing was done here, there's no problem, she's a permissible donor. If that's the case, why did she not donate directly to the political party? Because we did not know this money had come from George Cottrell's mother because it went to Richard Tice's company and then was basically used as a pass-through. That's not how transparency is supposed to work. And it does beg, I think, a lot of big questions about the funding of reform. Like I've reported on just how dependent reform is on a very small number of donors. These figures might have changed recently, but I did a story in Democracy for Sale a few months ago about how 3/4 of all the money reform and the Brexit party ever got had come from just 3 people, including Tice and Harborne. So this is a party that's got a handful of donors, and these are serious questions about these donors. We've also seen, Andrew, and the other question that underscores all of this is, have these donors changed party policy? It's very striking that one of the things that reform, it's not a political party with a huge number of detailed policies. One of the few areas that they have detailed policies in is cryptocurrency. And a huge chunk of reform's money has come from crypto donors. Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England this week, actually basically came out and said how Nigel Farage had lobbied him around cryptocurrency. He said it didn't change his mind, but that begs a big question. If you're going to go to meet the head of the Bank of England and you're a leader of the Reform Party, why aren't you asking about inflation, the cost of living, trade policies? Why are you asking about cryptocurrency?
And look, in terms of money and politics, it is always a contentious issue, and the transparency is really important, isn't it? Because the whole point of transparency in politics is, as you say, if people are going to, personally, I don't think anybody gives big money to politics without expecting something. I just don't buy that. I really believe in the maxim that he who pays the piper picks the tune, or at least puts in a couple of requests. And I do think that it is naive to, and by the way, you see this as well in the left of politics with trade unions, and they of course fund a lot of Labour politics, and there will be demands that the leadership of the Labour Party will feel from the leaders of the trade union movement. But that is why the transparency is so important. Do you think that the idea of transparency is going to survive in British politics? Because it does feel like people are finding ways of circumventing it.
Well, this is a big problem, I think, and you're completely right. You're hitting the nail on the head. Like this idea, we have conflicts of interest, and frankly, so long as we have running politics that runs on private money, whether that's from trade unions or individual donors, we will have conflicts of interest because political parties have to raise money, so they go to these people to try and raise money. And the people with the deepest pockets are the ones who get the most access because they're the ones who have the most money. What you're seeing with this is basically the transparency measures that we have, which I've reported on this issue for almost a decade. I report constantly on transparency failures, and so what we're seeing is almost the epitome of this. This is just showing just the gaping holes that we can have in transparency. It's kind of incredible timing. This is happening right now. So there is an elections bill going through Parliament. The Labour government under Keir Starmer brought together an elections bill. It's going to have it's going back to to Parliament next week, as it happens. And I think the original elections bill, it's fair to say, a lot of people, transparency experts say, it just doesn't go far enough. We're not really doing anything about, fundamentally in Britain, you can give unlimited amounts of money. Political donors can give as much money as they want, which actually isn't the case in the US. Political donors here in the UK can give as much as they want. As long as we have that system, I think we're going to see issues like this. And so there's a kind of timing here in the government, I think, as well, to say, okay, if you think this is a big problem, and clearly they do, listening to what senior ministers saying about this, well, why don't we, is there not kind of come time to act on this? We need more transparency, but also arguably there's a problem if people can give 5, 10, 15, 20 million pounds to politics.
And so I think what you've got there is you've got two issues. You've got the transparency, and then you've got the principle about should people be able to give those amounts of money. And I think both are legitimate questions. I suppose why the transparency is so important is that in the absence of being able to reduce the amount of big money that people can give into politics, and we have a cost of living crisis, we know the public finances are very tight. And actually, I'm going to throw this out to people at home. Would you be happy to take out the big money from politics and have you, as the taxpayer, fund politics? So it's state-funded politics rather than people trying to raise money. But I suppose, Peter, my kind of challenge question to myself and to you and having these debates is you've got to be realistic. I think it's hard in a cost of living crisis to say, right, the taxpayer is going to fund all politics and we just sort of stop big donations. I think that is, I'd quite like to see that, but I think it's quite difficult to sort of do. But the transparency becomes ever more important because then people at least can decide, look, take, for example, the Labour Party. The Labour Party, as I said earlier, has got a close association with the trade union movement. When there is a Labour government, there is always legislation in terms of strengthening workers' rights and things like that. That's kind of always been the case, and people put it in their manifesto. They can see that the trade unions have donated, and that's for people to make their decision. With the Conservative Party, they often get a lot of money historically from developers and the construction industry and the building industry. The Conservatives have always been quite kind of predisposed to that form of business and business in general. Conservatives traditionally have had more money in from business. Isn't the reality you are always going to get some kind of lobbying and some feeling from the leadership of a political party that they do have to give something back to their donors? But if the public can see it, then it is up to the public to decide whether they're comfortable with that.
Yeah, and I think before I answer that, I think it's worth saying as well, I think there's a halfway house as well between fully state-funded and the current free-for-all. One of the reasons we have so much money sloshing around our politics at the moment is that the spending limits in elections were massively increased by the last Conservative government. They're now very, very high. So you can actually spend way more money. So if you can spend more money, you're going to raise more money. There was no real need to do it. No one's gone near hitting these spending limits now, but they've become a stretch target. So political parties are now trying to raise more money to hit these spending limits. And frankly, 5 years ago, we had elections without those spending limits and they were totally fine. So I don't think I'm the only person that's going, do we need to have huge spending limits? Could we bring that down? Similarly, we only have transparency of spending during the year of a general election. So for 4 to 5 years of a parliamentary term, normally we have no transparency of spending.
Oh, I didn't know
We
that.
don't know where the money goes. No, most people don't. It's pretty crazy. And you and I know we are living in a constant politics now. It's 24/7. The idea that campaigning only happens during a general election is for the birds. But we can't see where that money is spent unless there's a general election happening. So there's a lot of things, short of state funding that are going on that I think are a real problem when it comes to this. And we've seen, I've tracked this and others have as well, just the extent to which the increase in money is really, really pronounced over the last 15 years. So we've seen this big increase. And one of the reasons it's increased so much is because you can give unlimited donations. So again, we had elections 20 years ago, 30 years ago with just a lot less money and they still ran. So there's, I could see how you could create a halfway house between that if you didn't want to state fund, and because you will end up with this problem of conflicts of interest. Because they are inherent if you have a small number of big donors. We've never done, there's also creative ways to encourage small donors. We just don't really do it in this country. Like you or I probably, I don't know people who donate to politics who aren't sources of mine. It's not something everyday people do, but there is ways and means to encourage small donations, etc., etc. We've in politics there's a thing called the 80-20 rule. 80% of your money, or for political fundraisers, 80% of your money comes from 20% of your donors. reform, I think it's the 99.1% rule when it comes to big donors. It's 99% from 1%. But in general, that's been the direction of travel, is more and more big money. And it seems to me that it's not going to be a panacea, and we will conflicts of interest. That's why transparency is important. That's why the work, I would argue, that people and I do, people like the Sunday Times do, is so important. But you would start to see, where if you took £5 million from a donor, that's just not okay. That becomes a serious red line, not something that we're having this discussion about. Should you declare it? Should you not declare it?